Hello Tool Kids, this is Greg Myers at Tools4Teens, and today we're going to discuss fasteners. That's nuts and bolts and washers and screws and all that kind of stuff. So to start with, how is a nut and a bolt different than a screw? Well, if you look at a bolt, the threads on it are very even from one end to the other, and there's always going to be a nut that's attached to a bolt, or that's used with the bolt. And that's because what you're trying to do is fit the nut and the bolt head between a couple of other pieces that you're trying to hold together. Okay? And with a screw, the threads are not necessarily even from one end to the other. You see how there's much narrower at the tip, and a screw generally has a pointy tip on it. And a screw is used by itself, and it's for going into a piece of wood or plastic, and by virtue of the wedging of the screw, it holds itself in place. Well, let's start out with nuts and bolts. So we talked about the fact that a bolt is evenly threaded from one end to the other, and there's bolts in all sizes. And a lot of bolts have a head like this on it, a hexagonal head on it. Okay, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides to it. Okay, and it comes in all sizes, and in the United States, what you can see is there's very fine threads and very coarse threads. As you get bigger and bigger, there's always a fine and a coarse thread that goes along with it. Okay, this particular gadget that I have here is really nice if you don't know what size it is, because you can put a nut on here to figure it out, or you can stick a bolt in the other end to figure it out. And it's all labeled. That's really handy to have something like that with you. And another way of figuring that out, okay, is with one of these gauges, one of these thread gauges, and these are all labeled with different threads per inch, okay, that you can take your bolt and put it up against one of these things and tell how many threads per inch there are. Now, usually in the United States, we have threads per inch, but they also have a metric version of this that goes by millimeters to figure it out. And it'll say something like 1.5 or 1.25 or 0.9. Okay, now there's all kinds of bolts here, and here's a typical bolt. And so you'll look at the head, and then look at, there's a shank to it. This is a part that doesn't have threads on it, and some have that, some don't. This is a coarse bolt, okay, and there's big ones and small ones, like I said, and nuts that go along with them. Okay, and look at that. See those lines on the end there? There's 3 lines sticking out, and that helps us to figure out how strong that bolt is. Now, this is what they call a 5-grade bolt, because it will be stronger than a bolt that doesn't have any lines on it. And you can get stronger than that yet. And here is what you call a grade 8. Now, it only has 6 lines on it, but this is called a grade 8 bolt. And you might want to use something like this, where you're really worried about how well that bolt is going to do under harsh conditions. And of course, they're more expensive. Now, what about this one right here? Well, this one doesn't really have a thread that's quite like that one, and it doesn't have a finer thread than that, This is actually metric. If we were to measure it, that one you'd see is metric. And after you look at enough nuts and bolts, you'll almost be able to recognize it. Now here's a special one. This is a stud, and look at this. On one end, it's a fine thread. On the other end, it's a coarse thread. And sometimes that's what you need depending on what kind of material that you're working with. If you're working with kind of a soft material, you might want to have kind of a coarse thread, because the soft material might rip through if the threads are too fine. Okay. Anyhow, what's this? This is actually quite an oddball. This is called a cheesehead bolt, and the thread count on this is an odd thread count you usually only found in things like British motorcycles or British cars. And it has a special hex socket head on it, okay? And so you need a special wrench, an Allen wrench, to work with one of those. Okay, well, now we've talked about bolts, let's talk about nuts a little bit. Well, here we go. These two nuts are actually the same size on the outside, but look at inside. This is a very coarse inside, very coarse thread per inch count. And this, you can see, is a much finer thread count. Okay, used for different purposes. Same thing here. Here's a little smaller one. Here's a fine one. Here's a much coarser one. And then there's specialty nuts too. See this one right here? Here it's got a fine thread on it, but look at the shape of it, like that, with that slope on there. This is a lug nut. This is for putting wheels on cars. And this part, this taper part, is to center the wheel, the holes in the wheels, against the lug nut, the studs that are in the wheel. Okay, here's another interesting one. This is a castellated nut. Now, let's say that you have something you really don't want to move. Okay, something like this would go on the end of something like this. Now, see that little hole in there? Well, what happens is that once this nut is threaded on, okay, then what happens is, this one's too big for that, but what happens is that you take a cotter pin and it goes through that hole that's in there, and it goes between these slots on the castellated nut, and then you bend that over, and that keeps that nut from turning. And that's very nice when you're working with something that you just have to be very careful about it not loosening up. Okay, well, what other ways can we keep things from loosening up? Well, one way is to use this type of fastener. This is a nut, but you'll see there's like some plastic stuff in there. That's a lock nut, okay, or a safety nut. And what happens is when you turn this on far enough, then it sort of gets stuck on there and keeps it from twisting off, keeps it from moving, okay? Another thing that you can have is lock washers. Now here's some different lock washers. Here's a great big one that would maybe go on that, okay? Here's a smaller one, and you'll notice that this has sort of a slice there, and then these are at different heights. This gives it sort of, when it gets tightened up, kind of a spring action in there to hold it in place. Here's another one, a star washer, and if you look real closely, you'll see that also has like little ramps on it that tighten up. There we go. That kind of tighten up to hold a nut in place, or the end of a bolt in place. Well, what else could you do? Well, you could use something like these. This is thread locker. Okay, thread locker is sort of like a glue that you can put on the end of a bolt to keep a nut from moving. And then sometimes you don't want that nut to get frozen on there, and you need anti-seize lubricant, and you paint a little bit of this on there, and that will always allow that nut that's on that bolt to loosen up. Okay, well, that's good. Well, another thing that's important is when you're making holes in something, or you're making threads on something, you need tools to be able to do that. Now, if you have something like a rod and you want to put threads on it, you use this. This is called a die. And if you look closely in there, what that has in it is little cutting edges there that look like the inside of a nut, but they're much sharper. And you can use that to cut threads onto a bolt, or not onto a bolt, but onto a rod that doesn't have any threads. Or on the other side of that, if you have a hole that you want to put threads in and sort of make it into a nut, okay, you take this thing, you drill a hole, and then you turn this gadget in that, and it cuts threads into the hole, and the little bits of metal get kind of caught in these grooves and they work their way out. Okay, kids, the key word for today is pitch. Okay, now, to make the world go a little smoother, you have to have washers. And washers are things that help nuts and bolts slide around. And also, they allow things to spread out the pressing force. Okay, so washers are really pretty important. This is what they call a fender washer. It's big and wide to spread the load out over a larger area. And then this is just a standard washer, and just like nuts and bolts, they come in all sizes. And then there's specialty washers, which you use for different purposes. Here's a shim washer, okay, and these come in different thicknesses and hole sizes to help you space things away and make them situate in just the right spot, say when you have important clearances. And then there's copper washers, which are used when you have two things that are carrying a fluid and you want it not to leak. So copper washers are really important when you're working on things that are especially higher pressure sorts of fluids. And then sometimes there's oddball washers, special washers that are made when you can't get a shaft off of something, but you need to put a washer around it somehow. You can cut the washer in half and then slide each side in around the shaft, and that acts as a washer. Only there's like two half washers. All right, well, so far we've talked just about nuts and bolts. Now we're going to talk about screws a little bit more. Well, normally when you think of screws, you think of like wood screws like a carpenter might use, and that's something like this. Here it is. Now this is a typical wood screw, and of course it has those grooves coming along here, those threads, not evenly. It starts itself out with a point to get into a piece of wood and jam itself and push the other wood out of the way. Okay, and they come in all various sizes and shank sizes. This is the shank, how deep it is going into a piece of wood. And then there's the head. Let's look at this head. This is a slot head, okay, and it's a countersunk slot head wood screw. Okay, you might use something like this if you're building a wood boat or something like that. Okay, well, what else do we have? We have screws like this. This is an oval head screw. You can see that it's more, there's sort of a rounded head to it, and then it still has that countersunk area to let it get further into a piece of wood. And this one still also has that nice sharp tip on it. Okay, and then there are screws that you might use for sheetrocking a house or different kinds of woodwork. Maybe you're making a deck. Here's a nice deck screw, and it has a head that takes a little square screwdriver end on it. Okay, and this has a pretty coarse thread pattern on it. This one does too. This is another type of screw that you might use putting your deck together or something like that. This has a Phillips head on it, and it has a countersunk area on it here that allows us to go flush with the surface of something. Well, let's talk about sheet metal screws. Sheet metal screws are for putting two pieces of sheet metal together. They generally look a lot like wood screws. They have a little bit of a point to them, and then they have a head. This is what they call a round head screw, and sometimes they have a Phillips head, countersunk head. You'll notice that the threads go all the way up to the head. Here's a pan head. This is what you most commonly will see. This particular pan head has a slot screwdriver head on it. Okay, and then there's other sheet metal screws that have hex heads on them, like this one, so that you could use either a hex head screwdriver or you could use a slotted screwdriver to put that in. Here's an interesting one right here. This one has like a drill bit at the end, so you don't have to even drill a hole. You just put this on the end of a power screwdriver or something, and it'll burrow its way right into the plastic or metal or even wood, I guess, that you want it to go into. All right, and then there's this thing. This is a lag screw, and this is for when you have like big pieces of lumber that you want to attach to each other, and it requires, you know, like a big socket to go on the end of this to get enough leverage to push that into a piece of wood. Well, that's all I've got for you today about nuts and bolts and screws and washers and things like that. You can't put the world together without them. Well, I'll see you next time on Tools for Teens.